situation in Ukraine.
Get more now on the war in Ukraine. And Moscow had planned to take control of Ukraine.
Let's turn to the war in Ukraine.
The Russians have no line of sight here.
The
Russian Truth Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the third episode of the Russian Truth Podcast, where I will be uncovering the truth about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I'm your host, Zanna Bizjukova, and on this podcast I will be uncovering the truth behind the war and the consequences that followed after. As someone who is Russian and Ukrainian, I want to dive deep and find the root of this conflict and how it has made two neighbouring countries go from being civil to being at war with each other. In this episode, I will be looking at the effects the war has had on the Ukrainian people and what their experiences have been with the war. I will be speaking to some guests who will tell me about their personal experiences. In this episode, I'll be joined by three guests. The first guest is Ukrainian but has lived in the UK for many years, and she will be telling me about how the war has affected her and her family and what it has been like going through all of that. The second guest is Ukrainian and because of the war has had to take everything and move out of Ukraine and has had to rebuild her life here in the UK. I will be asking her about what it's been like rebuilding her life here. The third guest is Ukrainian and has lived in the UK for many years. I'll be talking to him about how the war has affected him and his family. I will also be talking to him about the volunteer work he has done for Ukrainian refugees and the work he continues to do to help. The guests in this episode will remain anonymous and have their identities hidden to protect themselves and their privacy, as this is a sensitive topic to talk about. I'm now joined by my first guest, who is Ukrainian and has lived in the UK for many years. She will be telling me about how the war has affected her and her family and what it's been like going through all of this.
What did you feel when you first heard about the war in Ukraine?
We were at home talking to my sister on the phone and she said that she is scared and I told her that there was nothing to worry about. She lives in Western Ukraine. We were asleep and at 5 a.m. she messaged me saying that there are explosions going off along with the sirens. We were in touch with her all day on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and there was a lot of panic. To us, it seemed that it was only going to last for a couple of days and that it would all be over in a couple of days and that the war would soon stop. I was immediately very worried about her. I watched the news and saw that people were leaving. There were many people at the border. I couldn't believe it.
How did the war affect you personally while you were living here in the UK?
I began to pay more attention to people from Ukraine, especially those arriving in the UK. I also began teaching more Ukrainians who arrived here from Ukraine and needed to learn English. My family also began to read more Ukrainian literature and read about Ukrainian history. My children knew the basics of history and they were familiar with some Ukrainian literature, but they didn't know the roots of Ukrainian history and literature. They really wanted to know the root of the issue. When the war began, that was immediately what they wanted to know. Of course, my children began to ask questions such as, how is this possible? How can we continue to go to Russian school because we are Ukrainian? Why is this happening? How will we continue to live? What should we do? It was difficult to get used to it and accept it, but we found a way out, and what we did is we started to dig into history and went back to Soviet times.
How did the war affect your family living in Ukraine?
My sister with her two daughters live in Ukraine and my husband works as a truck driver, so he travels all over Europe and around England. Because of the war, he can't come to Ukraine. All of my family began meeting up across Europe because we couldn't come to Ukraine. My brother works in the Ministry of Emergency Situations and he is directly involved with the military. We are very worried about him and we constantly look at the phone and we follow his location to see where he is.
Has your relationship with Russian people changed because of the war?
My attitude towards Russian people has not changed, because well, I myself am half Russian and my father is from Nizhny Novgorod in Russia. He graduated from a university in Moscow in 1971. He came to Kremenchuk, Ukraine, and since then he had lived in Ukraine. My mother is from Western Ukraine and studied in St. Petersburg, and graduated from the university. They also sent her to Kremenchuk. This is where my parents met and got married, and my attitude towards Russian people has not changed. Of course, my attitude towards the government of Russia has changed because of everything that has happened.
The next guest I will be speaking with is Ukrainian, and because of the war has had to take everything and move out of Ukraine and has had to rebuild her life here in the UK. I will be asking her what it's been like rebuilding her life here in the UK and whether it's been an easy journey or a difficult one.
First question, what did you feel when you first heard about the war in Ukraine?
Good afternoon. Well, I felt dread, of course, because just 2 days before the war I and my husband returned home from a holiday in Sri Lanka. We hadn't even unpacked our suitcases yet. Therefore, to me, it seemed that this was all a terrible dream, and I was wondering when I would wake up so that it would all end.
How did the war affect you personally?
Well, my business back in Ukraine had to be shut down and left behind. My family has been divided into 2 parts because I am with my daughter here in Cambridge and my husband is restricted to travel abroad by age and he is stuck in Ukraine. This has caused me and my family a lot of stress and depression. But it's all very difficult to lose everything that you had because someone decided to destroy your peaceful life and your peaceful family.
How did the war affect your family?
Well, my family has been divided into 2 parts and I don't understand how to go forward with life and continue living like this. I used to have a successful business and I loved working, but now I am here in the UK living off of government money and trying to learn English somehow to try and fit in here. Meanwhile, my husband is in Ukraine trying to survive. Every time I think of him I worry. Every time I watch the news I worry, especially seeing how close the military is to your house. It's hard seeing all of that.
Has your relationship with Russian people changed because of the war?
No, my attitude hasn't changed because this is my second war. I am from Baku and I am half Russian, therefore I understand that it does not depend on what your nationality is and what is written on your passport. It all depends on how you think, what are your values in life and what is your priority. It doesn't matter whether you are Russian, Ukrainian, or English. There are quite a lot of people of other nationalities who do not necessarily support the war.
The third and final guest of this episode I will be speaking with is Ukrainian and has lived in the UK for many years. I will be talking to him about how the war has affected him and his family. I will also be talking to him about the volunteer work he has done for Ukrainian refugees and the work he continues to do to help.
What did you feel when you first heard about the war in Ukraine?
So well, at that moment, the only thing I know I felt was shock because all of this was so unexpected. Before everyone was saying that this wasn't possible, but then suddenly it ends up happening. All I remember in the first few minutes of hearing about the war, I remember I was getting calls from my children and relatives who were in Ukraine. The only thing I had running through my mind was, how could this happen?
How did the war affect you personally while you were living here in the UK?
Well, all my relatives are living in Kiev. We would all speak on the phone every day and check up on each other. Every morning started with questions and checking up on my family and seeing whether they were safe or not. We would also communicate in the evening and the same questions would be asked. So in a nutshell, that's how the war has affected me personally.
How did the war affect your family living in Ukraine?
Well, thank God, at the moment, all of my family members are alive. My eldest daughter left Ukraine for Poland to visit my friends there, and my youngest daughter came to England for a while. Well, of course, the first few months were stressful because we didn't know what was going on. These first few months were difficult as we didn't know what to do or how to continue living with this. Every male in my family volunteered for the army on the first day of the war. My eldest daughter's husband also volunteered, and my second daughter's husband and his brother also volunteered. In this situation, our family rallied together to support one another. We tried to help each other in any way we could. Everyone has their own life, their own business, but somehow they came together and supported each other, despite some quarrels in the past and some other nuances. A big effect I saw that the war had on my family was when one of my daughters was staying in England with me. Her son, who is quite young, would get easily scared and triggered by loud sounds. When he heard fireworks, he started panicking, put his head between his knees and started asking his mum what was going on. This war has had a traumatizing impact on people, and it's hard to tell when that trauma will pass because those memories will stay for a long time.
From what I know, you flew to Poland to do volunteer work and you continue to do volunteer work. What was it like to go to Poland and help Ukrainian refugees?
Well, yes, I did fly to Poland and volunteer, although I can't say that I worked as a volunteer or am still working as one. I just decided that I wanted to help in some way. I also wanted to receive truthful information, because the media in both Ukraine and Russia have been putting out information which is completely different to one another. It is also not clear where the truth is, where the lie is. At the end of March, I found an advert in a group where they were looking for a driver who knew English and could help formulate transportation of refugees from Ukraine to European countries, specifically Poland, as a large number of Ukrainian refugees went to Poland and it was necessary to resettle people. This is what volunteer centers did. They would organize all of this. It was me and some other people who wanted to help transport people. In total, I traveled for 2 weeks. I traveled from Poland to France, Germany, Austria, and even Switzerland. That was my first trip. My second trip was in the summer, which involved me doing the same stuff. I was already involved in helping my brother, who is the battalion commander, and they needed me to transport special equipment. I cannot say what special equipment was needed. We found several companies that produced this special equipment and I drove to Poland to pick it up. There were lots of volunteers from different countries such as America, Canada, and New Zealand. But they simply did not speak Russian or Ukrainian, so it was necessary for me to translate. In general, we provided lots of assistance to specific organizations who wanted to provide assistance to the Ukrainian refugees. We collected food and money which was sent off to Poland. Everyone has been affected by this. People from Ukraine, people living in Ukraine, and people who have family and friends in Ukraine. So we tried to help where possible by volunteering.
The impact this war has had on Ukrainians is horrendous, and hearing about people's first-hand experiences has really shocked me. The effect that it has had on both the Russian and Ukrainian people is astronomical. These political games have cost thousands of lives, and unfortunately that number will continue to grow unless the war stops. But at the moment it isn't looking like that. My heart truly goes out to all the people who have been affected by this war, along with their families who have also been affected. I would also like to thank all of my guests who have spoken with me in this episode and throughout the last couple of episodes, as I know this topic is very difficult and sensitive to talk about. And that is it for this episode of the Russian Truth podcast. If you enjoyed the episode and listened to it on YouTube, please like and subscribe, but also don't forget to give your opinions in the comments section down below. If you listen to the podcast on either Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, don't forget to follow The Russian Truth there. I would also like to say a big thank you to all my guests who have joined me on this episode. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.
Situation in Ukraine.
Get more now on the war in Ukraine. Moscow had planned to take control of Ukraine.
Let's turn to the war in
The
Ukraine.
Russians have no line of sight here.
The Russian Truth podcast.